Welcome to the CMO Spotlight, and I am so excited to have this conversation today with Ben Boyd, who is the Chief Communications Officer for Chobani. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Joe. So great to be here.
I'm excited to have this conversation. And full disclosure, Ben and I are friends from way back in college, from a long, long time ago. So I'm
You're gonna
even
date us pretty quickly here. Be careful.
exactly. Exactly. So I wondered if we could just begin the conversation by your telling us a little bit more about Chobani as a company, and then we'll talk about your role there and then the path to getting there. But maybe let's just start about talking about the company Chobani. Many of us know Chobani is the yogurt that we can buy at grocery and that kind of thing. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean it's 20 years old next year, right? Pretty remarkable story. Our founder CEO came to this country with literally nothing, escaping persecution in Turkey, and just I think is a little bit of a visionary, a little bit crazy. You have to be to just kind of decide to buy a yogurt company in upstate New York that is being closed by one of the biggest food and beverage companies in the world. His lawyer told him he was crazy. He put together a business plan, got a small business loan, and here we are, $3 billion and 20 years later. And I think it's a testament to sort of, I think, his vision, his tenacity. I think the powerful part about Hamdi's story, which is so special, is he grew up hating business.
Mm,
Didn't study business, didn't know anything about it, and actually believed business was the fault of so much inequality. And I think as he got into it, what he was committed to was making a business that was all about natural, nutritious, delicious, accessible food, which is kind of our North Star, but also a business that would, that would unquestionably commit to the communities where we work, live, and play, and also contribute to those communities, right? So from a little field restoration in South Edmonston, New York, that was, an early example, to the tractor trailer loads of super milk, which is a product that we launched earlier this year, not for sale, designed specifically for disaster relief.
mm.
Shelf stable. So in a post-disaster scenario, when there's no refrigeration, you can still use this product. And so be that, Western North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, which is where we've deployed to, the milk that we have pre-positioned to support those folks in Florida in terms of what they've just gone through. It's just a great example of living values and
Mm.
seeing through the commitment to be an impact company.
Well, I'm surprised to know that Chobani's only been in existence for 20 years,
Yeah.
given the ubiquity of the brand. I mean, for those of us who are Costco shoppers, I buy Chobani at Costco and at all the grocery stores. It is, clearly a market leader when it
Yeah.
comes to your category. And so it's fascinating that that's all happened within 20 years. And you said,
Yeah.
I think, $3 billion. That's a huge amount of growth.
Yeah, I think it's a testament, to the focus on food. And I think
Mhm.
it's the quality of the food, right? No preservatives, as I said, all natural. Also conscious about price points, right? So as we've all lived sort of inflation over these past couple of years and a lot of stories about increase in food prices, we haven't taken a price increase in 2 years, right? So
Mm.
making good food, but making sure that good food is accessible is incredibly important. And so now you see that same formulation and commitment to natural, nutritious, delicious has taken us into oat milk. It's taken us into the coffee creamer aisle, which is a natural extension.
Yeah,
So much of what you see in that coffee creamer section is oil-based, and we are pure dairy. And so I think the innovations are natural extensions, and not too far afield, but always with that commitment to natural, nutritious, delicious, and accessible.
awesome. I love it. So let's talk a little bit about your role as
Yeah.
Chief Communications Officer. And I know your path has been largely through the PR space, and we'll talk a little bit about that path in a minute,
Yeah.
where you've been agency side, you've been client side, you've kind of gone back and forth over your career. But I'm just curious about the role of Chief Communications Officer within Chobani and what that means for you.
Look, I came in with the remit to rebuild a function about 7 months ago. I'm incredibly excited about the team that we now have in place. I sort of designed a function based on my career experience at this point. So there's sort of four fundamental parts of the function, if you will. Central to the function is what I call our content and editorial team. So they both capture the content, package the content, but they're responsible for sort of the editorial, maybe a bad word, matrix, where we try to think about every announcement and how do we make every piece of content and everything that we announce work across channel. And then sort of the four areas of focus beyond that underpinning team is impact communications. You've already heard me talk about the impact we have, and so
Mhm.
a focus on telling that story and making certain that we engage consumers, that we engage our employees in volunteer opportunities, et cetera. Second would be obviously what I call brand lifestyle. So back to school, how does yogurt fit in back to school, right? Well, I'll tell you how, right? It's a great source of protein with a high satiety level, meaning like I stay fuller for longer. So it's important for
You
parents.
you say you stay sated.
Sated, right? So for me to stay fuller longer. So I want
Yeah.
moms to know that, I'm a preferable lunchbox item.
Yeah.
And so how do we play into the cultural moments? We just did a great, or we're in the midst of a really interesting play for Hispanic Heritage Month, and a drink design that we crafted just from a PR com standpoint, right? To have us in
Mhm.
that conversation. So that's just driving social relevance across all channels, including social. Obviously, internal is incredibly important, right? 3,000 employees across, multiple locations, and they are the backbone of what we make happen every single day. And then lastly would just be obviously what I call one Chobani communications, which is our external reputation, corporate, if you want to use a traditional term, corporate communications, in terms of those business stories, reputational plays, executive positioning. So that's sort of the architecture for the team. And I think I've always viewed comms as an incredibly horizontal function within
Yeah.
a corporate environment, right? We're one of the only pieces of functionally that touches all aspects, right? We
Yeah.
we collaborate with marketing, we collaborate with the CEO, we collaborate on, our financial performance. So I think that what I've said to the team is that we have to be good conveners. And we have to set those tables intentionally, and we have to ask really good questions as opposed to thinking we always have the answers. So that's sort of
Mhm.
a little bit about how I think about both the structure of the function and the function of the function.
And then you mentioned the team a couple times. Just roughly, how big is the team? And I guess they're divided by some of those different functions that you just
Yeah.
mentioned.
Team is structured in those five areas that I outlined, but very much in a functioning matrix by design, right? Like I
Hmm.
think we tend to think of I tend to challenge them to identify who's the quarterback of an announcement, of an initiative, of campaign, but then what from our team, who from our team needs to be at that table, that integrated team, and then what's the cross-functional team, right? Bigger than comms that we convene and put together. And so it's 21 people now, with a consumer agency, as well as a corporate agency with, I would say, modest retainers, but the opportunity in those moments of campaign and of bigness, for us to spend supplementals with them. So having spent
Right.
time on the agency side, I want to be the client that I always wish I had.
That's awesome. Well, so let's talk about the path. And I think you were an English lit major at Wake
Yeah.
Forest University, so go Deeks. And but I think you immediately went to work for an agency for 3 years, then you went on the client side, and then you spent a long time at Edelman,
That's right.
and then you ended up making your way back to the client side for the last several gigs. So just walk us through kind of the path that led you to Chobani today.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. My
Mhm.
dad was like, "What in the hell are you going to do with an English major?" And
Right, of course.
I think I was just crazy enough to think that mattered without really an intentional design to that. Although I'm
Yeah.
incredibly planful, so I have no idea what was going on at that point. But yeah, I found myself, my very first job after Wake was on Capitol Hill as a young uh, team member for a representative where I did communications work, I guess,
Mm,
which
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that would be probably a disservice to communications. But that then set me on the path that, that you talked about, Hill and Knowlton, an early agency experience where I kind of got to see that work for what was a great agency at that time. Amazing lessons. Pivoted to barnesandnoble.com, which was, competing against this new upstart online bookseller called Amazon, right?
Heard of them.
We know how that turned out.
Yeah.
And then I think, yeah, a couple other bounces, but yeah, then a big landing at Edelman. When I got to Edelman, it was about 300 million. When I left, it was a billion. I spent 10 of those 15 years reporting to Richard. And I think the reason that Edelman worked and fit for so long was Edelman was a place of innovation and reinvention. And,
Mm,
I always thought that I think I still believe reinvention is each of our responsibilities. So when things were out of whack for me, or I was feeling like I was hitting a ceiling at Edelman, I always tried to go to Richard with a vision for what I could do next, where I could create value. And I'm incredibly lucky that I got 5 different opportunities, really different jobs to contribute to the success of that agency, but more importantly, Joe, to the success of our clients. I loved the client work. I loved being, what I would call 5 miles wide and, a couple inches deep, probably deeper than that on certain engagements because you have to be.
mhm,
And then I felt like after 15 years at agency, it was an opportunity to pivot back. And I was fortunate enough to work for Marissa Thalberg, CMO at Lowe's, who hired me into a brand that I loved. If I'm not at my desk on the weekends, I'm in the garden. And so this was a brand that was near and dear to my heart. And so moved down from New York to Charlotte, North Carolina for a couple years. Over that time, which was the pandemic, my husband and I got a Peloton, and I became a fanatic. Um, and it's
As
wild.
a lot of
Yeah,
people got
I
Pelotons
joined a lot
during
of
the
people,
pandemic.
right, in that.
Yeah.
But that company was going through some bumps and gurgles and coming out of the
Mhm.
pandemic and looking to transform itself. And that's when my phone rang for the opportunity to come back to New York and join Peloton. I was like, how can I not do this, right? So it was sort of like one of two calculus, right? We turn this thing around. It would be an amazing ride, no pun intended, right? I'd learn a ton and I wouldn't have to work again, right? Or I would learn a ton and it would be an amazing ride and I would figure out what was next. And so now I'm at Chobani. And so I have the utmost belief that the Peloton story is not over. But the opportunity to come to Chobani was incredibly powerful. I think, I always viewed Peloton as an impact brand, right? I think
Mhm.
a company that is so doggedly focused and committed to health and wellness it is driving impact in the world. So it's just I feel like I came to a different impact company. I think I'm incredibly excited for Peloton now and some of the innovations that I'm seeing coming out of there. It was an amazing 2 years as we rebuilt the balance sheet. I absolutely learned more in those 2 years than I have at any other point in my career. And then that's how I'm here in New York and found my way to Chobani.
It's interesting. It seems like health and wellness has been a kind of a theme for you throughout, because even when you talk about going to work for Lowe's, you mentioned it's because I like being out in the garden and working
Yeah,
in the garden. And then you go to work for Peloton, where it's literally a fitness, company. And
yeah,
then you go to work for a company that's dedicated to
yeah,
healthy, quality food. So
yeah.
it seems like that's even been maybe as you progress in your career, that's become more of a priority.
Yeah, I think it's a good observation. I maybe probably too generous to say it was intentional or
Mm,
design. I think I do think, the phone rang for other things, right? I mean, just to
right.
be honest. And that's just to say that I believe I have to have a connection with the place I'm working. We spend so much time at work, right? And I do think that each of us has the responsibility to give back and contribute. There's a million ways to do that, but for me, there is a linkage between what I'm doing day in, day out, and my belief sort of in the mission or the value
Mhm.
creation of the company. So, that there's no judgment in that. That's just for me, what excites me and ignites me is when think about that Venn diagram, right? What am I good at professionally? What are my life passions? And if you're lucky enough to have significant overlap in those two, then I think you're lucky, and I certainly have been.
I love that. Well, so I'm curious if there's a piece of advice that you maybe wish you had gotten early in your career, or maybe this is a piece of advice you'd give somebody who's just starting out a communications or PR or marketing career.
Yeah. That's a great, I love that question. I folks who reach out to me, actually a young woman from Wake Forest I spoke to just earlier this week. Anybody that writes me early in career and I think has the gumption to reach out and say, "Will you have a conversation with me?" I always say yes. And I
Yeah.
tend to have a similar piece of advice, but for me, even today, it's evolving a little bit, right? That piece of advice is recognize as early as you possibly can that your career is a series of chapters. And
Hmm.
each chapter at some point in time, for some reason, is going to come to an end. And that's just the end of that chapter. And what's incredibly exciting is you get to then design what the next one is.
Hmm.
Sometimes that's smooth transition, sometimes that's bumpy transition. I think the evolution that I mentioned to you, Joe, is I think if I look back on some of my chapters, I think going into them, I pre-designed how they were going to unfold. And I would say embrace the newness of the chapter, but then be open to the unexpected in terms of how that story plays out. Be open to the fact that it may not be a great chapter, but don't get mired in that, right? Know that again, there's going to be an end to this, and then look forward and think about what's next.
Absolutely. So I believe everybody has a superpower. So I'm curious what you feel your superpower is.
Wow, I don't know that
What have you been told your superpower is by others?
well, I think it's probably an innate curiosity that has enabled
Mm,
me to kind of to take in a lot of information and distill it down, which I think is the ultimate job of a communicator, right? I think that what I've refined in that superpower is the asking of questions. I think early in career, we think we have to have all the answers. Certainly on the agency side, you're led to believe that you have to have all the answers. I think powerful, thoughtful, intentional questions are
mhm,
far better than answers because you're really helping the person that you're working with, that you're working for, the client that you're supporting, really unpack and get to the core of what they're trying to solve. So I think it's the ability to take all that in, process it, ask the right questions, and then think about the path forward or paths forward, and be able to articulate, the recommendation. I've always said that communications does not drive strategy. Communications make strategy relevant and resonant to the right
mm,
stakeholders, right? And so I've always understood that I'm not a decision-making function. I'm a decision-informing function.
mhm.
Right. So I think that I guess that would be the superpower, maybe.
I love it. Well, that's a relevant one in your business, particularly. It's probably why you've been so successful in your,
Right.
career path so far. I'm curious if there are some values that you either want to demonstrate as a leader, or maybe
Mm.
these are values that you would demand of anybody that would be a part of your team.
I think empathy is incredibly
Mm,
important, and I don't know that we talk about it enough. I don't know what's going on for my team members outside of work, right? And so I think it's understanding that I don't know fully, and how can I support them fully by being inquisitive, by giving them real-time feedback, by checking in. And I mean that also for my peers and my bosses, right? Because all of those folks are living, complex lives just like I am. So I think empathy is incredibly important. I think fairness,
mm,
is another North Star. When I think about coming in house and these three roles, the first thing I did was look at roles, remits, and total compensation, right? It was
mm,
incredibly important to me that everyone was comped fairly. And so my expectations of the team are fairly aligned against their jobs and their performance. And I want to be treated fairly, right? And so I think these values for me are, kind of go both ways, right? And so
mhm.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
those are a couple of really important ones.
So I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about marketing and
Okay.
communication stuff. And you mentioned agencies a couple times earlier. So here at Setup, we're marketing matchmakers, and that often means we connect brands with agencies that can support them. And so we're not on the client side. We don't live on the client side. We're not on the agency side. We sort of live in that space between. But we
Right.
think a lot about that relationship between agency and client. I know you've lived that relationship from both sides over the course of your career.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious about just generally, how do you like to work with agencies? You mentioned you want to be the kind of client you wished that you had when you were on the agency side. So how do you work with agencies?
Well, let me say I did have some of those great clients, right? Who
Yeah,
I
yeah,
learned a
I'm
lot
sure.
from. Karen Kahn, who's now at Intel, was at HP and it was phenomenal. I worked with GE when Beth Comstock and Gary
Mm,
Sheffer and Eric Latour were there, just by way of example. I wanted to be, and I want my agencies to be extensions of the team, right? And I think that you got to really unpack what does that mean, right? You got to bring them under the tent. You've got to trust them. It's about relationships. I want my agencies to know what's going on, even if they're not directly involved in that project or that work, because I need them to have a holistic view of kind of where the business is. So I try to make sure that, you know, in the way that my team is managing the agencies, but also my access to them and their access to me is something that I prioritize, as a matter of time. A monthly lunch with my agency leads just to
mm,
hear how they think things are going, share with them how we think things are going. Because otherwise, if you put that off, I think you find yourself at a point of disconnect or you find yourself at a point of dissonance. There's some
mhm,
problem, right? They feel they're over servicing, working too hard, and or you feel like the quality's not there. There's a million other ways to think about that, right? But I think if we are communicators, and the wicked irony of being communicators is that oftentimes it's the communications between client and agency is broken. And so I really try to make sure I'm a big believer in real-time feedback, both for the team, but also for the agency, good, bad, and indifferent, right?
absolutely. So I'm curious if there are certain disciplines of communications or marketing where you feel you would want to keep that in-house because
Mm.
it's core to who you are or something like that. And are there certain other disciplines within communications or marketing that you feel you would want to get the outside perspective from
Mm.
agency support?
That's a great question. I would say that so this is my third in-house at this like kind of later
Yeah,
point in my career. I don't think any of my three teams have been exactly the same. So
right. Oh, yeah,
I think you have to build the function. It has to be built for purpose and to fit the enterprise. And there's a lot of dynamics in different enterprises that are bigger than comms. And I think comms has to meet the organization where it is. So I don't know that there's any one thing that I'd say I'd keep 100% in-house. I expect that. So then what, I guess the way I think about your question is what were consistencies across
yeah,
my experience. Everyone has got to be able to work with media, right? This is not, pitching is not an outsourced skill set, right? If you can't talk to a journalist, then who can you talk to, right? They're
right, right,
not, they're not three-eyed monsters that are completely
right,
right. And candidly, there's fewer of them. There's
right,
thinner. And they need to know who you are so that when you do call, that they know that there's value in taking that call. I think that good writing, you have to be able to write. I think it's overblown the notion of AI is going to replace my writers.
right.
Is it going to replace first drafts? Maybe on some of the
Yeah, right, right,
repetitive
right,
things,
right.
right? Have I used it for a first draft? Yes. If you're watching this and you haven't, like go do that because you're going to
Yeah,
get left behind, right? It can do some impressive first drafts. But I think the personalization of that draft to the culture, to the tone, to the phraseology, to the word choice, that's an art.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's robotic. I think the thing that I would want from my agencies unequivocally is an outside in perspective. I want them to push back. I want them to say, have you thought about this? And in order for them to do that, again, I've got to commit to the time and the give and take for them to be able to do that, right? I also want to, from my agencies, understand and experience best practices or innovations that they're seeing, with other clients. I want to be an innovator, but I also know there's only so much I can do at this one company at this one point in time. And so I want to learn what others are doing. And I
Yeah.
want the agency I don't mean that in a case study presentation. I want an actionable idea brought to me that
Right.
then implement, informed by innovation and success that other clients have achieved.
Well, it's interesting. On the agency side, you may work on automotive one day and
Yeah,
CPG the next day
yeah,
and retail the next day. And, so you go pretty wide in different verticals and different
yeah.
companies and industries. Whereas on the client side, get to go pretty deep. The same problems that you're dealing with yesterday when you left work are the ones you're still tackling this morning when you get there.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like part of that breadth of or diversity of experience from different categories, different clients. You expect your agency to bring ideas that I have from the airline industry or some other industry that might be relevant for you.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's the value that I think I provided on the agency side was again that ability to look horizontally across the client portfolio, to your point, and look at, okay, think about heavily regulated industries, right? Financial services, pharma, right? Like there's not a lot of similarities in terms of core competency, but in terms of like how you navigate a highly regulated environment, there's a lot to talk about and be learned
Mm-hmm.
one side from the other, right? And I think that shame on me if I don't ask the agency for what are those insights, right? Shame on the agency if they don't bring those to me.
Yeah. So I'm curious how you demonstrate the value of communications or even the value of marketing from a broader sense to the non-marketing functions within the organization. 'Cause I think sometimes everybody fancies themselves an amateur communicator of some kind, right?
Completely, completely, yeah. I think for the bigger efforts, and especially when we do something new, I want KPIs set out in advance, right? So here's a great example. We this week were in Minneapolis at FNCE, which is the trade meeting for registered dietitians in this country,
Hmm.
right? The biggest of the year. Who are the most quoted sources in articles about food and nutrition in media today? Registered dietitians. We launched a 20-gram protein cup, which is the first time we've delivered 20 grams of protein in a single cup. We don't do that with added powders. We do that through enhanced um, uh, um, filtration, which
Hmm.
allows us to, bring a greater protein level to that product in a
Cool.
time when consumers are craving more protein. 72% of consumers today want more protein in their diet, right? How do I get it? So what we wanted in this instance was to have the registered dietitians know about and love the product, right?
Hmm.
So KPIs, and these aren't rocket science, right? How many samples can we give away across the attendees? We hosted a breakfast. How many folks could we get at that breakfast to, have a top line presentation on the food science behind that protein product? Number three, we created what we call the Chobani Health Network, which was an opportunity for them to opt in to hear from us, for us to communicate to them on an ongoing basis, but for them to also dialogue back with us. How many folks could we, secure in that network for ongoing dialogue? And then, the KPI at the outset was half a dozen media conversations from an earn standpoint, not for immediate coverage, but for informing longer term conversations. And so that's an example of kind of how we set the measures out for that one instance, based on the investment that we were making as a company.
Very cool. All right, so I got one more kind of PER,
Yeah.
communications, marketing related question. Then we've got some rapid fire, just ones
Okay.
to wrap up. I'm curious, and this was a very good example of what you just talked about, but I'm curious if there's a program or a campaign or something that you worked on either at Chobani, but or maybe even one of your past roles that taught you an important lesson, either because it was a flop and you learned something that you needed to really learn, or it was a huge success that maybe you'd like to emulate in some way in the future.
I think the most impactful work experience from this is not going to be a traditional answer to your question, right? So, um, I don't remember the exact year. There was a tsunami that hit Japan. I think, many people remember that. There was a nuclear
Hmm.
reactor or a series of
Knocked
reactors,
out the Fukushima power
right?
plant.
Yeah, the Fukushima, right?
Yeah.
What a lot of people didn't know and may still not know is that GE at that point was, a much bigger conglomerate and actually was responsible for design build on a number of those reactors.
Mm.
What folks may not know or may not remember rather is that the Japanese government was faulted from a comm standpoint of not being transparent, of not sharing information. I joined, and from an agency standpoint, I led the agency side of the war room that was set up to negotiate that. And the
Mm.
strategy and the goal of that effort was to provide as much information from credentialed experts as possible to media who were craving insight on how to cover this would-be disaster, right? Or it was a disaster. And so there's so much I learned from that. That's probably where the light bulb went off about questions, right? I don't know nuclear engineering, right?
Right.
And so, but I know what my parents' questions would be about that, right?
Right.
I didn't have to become a nuclear engineer. I had to be able to convey and explain what was going on in a way that I always talk about, that my parents could understand.
Hmm.
Right? I think it was understanding the complexity again of whatever ecosystem you're working in, agency, client, right? That was an incredibly complicated situation for GE, for everybody involved. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And so
Hmm.
there was a contribution that I could make. But again, that's sort of where that informing, not deciding. So it wasn't a lot of recommendations that were made in that war room by me as the agency lead. There were a lot of questions, and I was then a part of a lot of conversations in which the client ultimately decided what they were going to do going forward. I think I also learned learned and admired the leadership of on the client side in terms of their transparency and their trust because we were in that war room, which was incredibly sensitive and highly volatile, and was working. I think at the fever pitch there were two briefings to the CEO. Every day. Some of those, I participated in, some of those I didn't. But that was a really transformative experience for me. Probably all the more so because when it started, I was just getting over the flu. And the first 3 days, I think, were maybe 2 hours of sleep each night. Um,
Oh man.
so there was an intensity to it. But when it was over, I think part of the reason that it still sticks with me is the sense of pride that we had in terms of, success, however you want to define that, right? Protecting the brand and reputation, more importantly, making sure that the media who were covering this disaster had the information that they needed to provide more fulsome insights to impacted, consumers in Japan, but really globally as everybody was sort of watching this situation unfold.
Crazy. Okay, we're going to have a couple of rapid fire to wrap it
Okay.
up. So the first is there a quote or a book or a movie or a sports team or a band that inspires you? And what is it about that particular thing that inspires you most?
Hmm. That's rapid fire, which I'm going to draw a blank on. I don't.
Well, it could be any of those things.
Yeah, I think I'm a quote guy,
Yeah.
episodically for different reasons and different instances. I'm not sure that there's a life mantra or a life quote. I think, any underdog, right? I think is always inspiring. I don't think I'm alone in that on any front. So yeah, I don't know. I think for me, I think inspiration has been more episodic throughout my life, right? Like, what am I
Mhm.
going through? What am I living? What is the
Right. What do
moment?
you need most in your life
Yeah,
at this point?
exactly, right? Different phases of life, different chapters, right? Need different inspiration. So I don't have a really great answer for you on that one.
Okay. I thought you were going to say Rudy when you started saying underdog, something like that. One of those kinds of movies. Excellent. Well, so other than your husband or your family, which is an easy answer, where do you find joy outside of work?
We're incredibly blessed to have a place in upstate New York in the Berkshires, and
Mm.
every weekend I am outside, um, doing something in the garden, and I mean heavy gardening at times. I have a couple of chainsaws, and I'm cleaning,
Wow.
some woods. I have a tractor. I find great joy in just being on that tractor. It's funny. I grew up on a big tobacco farm in South Carolina. I couldn't wait to get away from that, right? And now I
Right.
live in Manhattan, right? And have for almost 20 years. And I can't wait to get out of here and go
Yeah.
to,
Well, you can't take the farm
yeah,
out of the boy kind of
exactly,
thing, I
exactly.
guess.
So,
Um,
yeah, there you go.
okay, my last question is just, is there a brand that you've never worked on that you really admire, and what is it about that brand that you admire most?
Wow, that's a great question and a hard one. A brand that
Yeah.
I've never worked on because I've been so lucky to work on so
Yeah.
many, amazing brands, having been at the agency for 15 years. Apple, I think, has done a remarkable job of sort of maintaining an integrity to a design North Star, right? I'm a big Apple user. I think their ecosystem is, for me, simple, easy, powerful. I also then think of like smaller brands, right? I think Katie Couric has just made herself an incredible brand as a
Mm.
media entity right now, and
Wow.
where she is and how she's navigating. I listen to her podcast, The Next Question, all the time, and that's just one of many ways that she's still incredibly relevant, incredibly respected and trusted as a journalist. And I think journalistic brands today are, under assault in a highly polarized world. I also just think of a Patagonia, right? In terms of like
Mm.
the original, you could argue, for profit that said, we're gonna do both. We're gonna make money and we're gonna make positive impact. And I think they were, for me, one of the early leaders in that space. So I think those are very different examples.
Awesome.
But yeah, really powerful brands.
I love it. Well, so Ben Boyd is the Chief Communications Officer of Chobani. He's a Wake Forest English literature graduate from graduate of Wake Forest University, and so I really appreciate our time together, Ben. This has been so much fun to have this conversation.
Joe, thank you so much. It's been so great to reconnect with you, and this was an awesome experience. Thank you very much.